Before we get started with the value study, take a look at your pack of charcoal and see if you can find a piece that's a little bit thicker than the rest. Try some really broad strokes where you're using about an inch or two of the side of the charcoal instead of the point. After a few strokes, you should be able to get a nice, even broad stroke. The next thing I'm going to do is create a value scale. So I'm creating these 5 squares that I'm going to fill with charcoal and try to make them progressively go darker and darker. So I actually like to start with the darkest square because then I can press really hard and then adjust my pressure from there. I recommend using the side grip for this and just practicing how to adjust that pressure and how to grip it really well. And then you're going to use the stump to blend these squares out. So the thing here, the most important thing to keep in mind is try to create these squares without any contours. So there are going to be no outlines around the squares. And then also try to make them really even throughout. One of the things I wanted to show you here is a close-up of how to use the stump correctly. So you're going to be holding the stump in such a way where that entire edge comes in contact with the paper. Basically, you can see where the charcoal is on the stump, so that whole cone part will be in contact with the paper. So try not to lift the stump off of the paper and just use the very point, because the stump does get sanded down every time you use it, and it's important to maintain that shape so that you can actually have control over how you blend parts of your drawing. Alright, so we're ready to get started, and here's my still life. You can see that I found a couple of dark objects, a couple of bright ones, and then a couple of objects that are in between. So it's important to practice the value study on various kinds of objects that have different values, so you can really get a sense of how to do the shadows and highlights on all of these. The first thing I'm going to do is create a value scale at the top of the paper, and this scale is going to have 10 steps, so it's going to be quite a bit more challenging than the last one we did. I'm starting my drawing with a mass gesture study, which means that I'm using the side of the charcoal and blocking out areas of light and dark just to get a sense of how things are structured. And as you can see, there are no lines involved here, so that's going to be different, and it's going to be challenging at first, but it actually is a lot easier to create a structure of the drawing this way than to use lines, since you already get all the values in really quickly. After the first minute of this, I am starting to refine things a little bit, so I'm trying to find some nuances and changes in value throughout objects. So I started out by just getting a sense of like which objects are darker, which ones are lighter, and that's it. But now I'm trying to break those objects down into smaller portions and find areas that have darker and lighter values. And now I'm drawing some of the cast shadows. So those are going to be quite important. And those are the shadows on the table. And the cast shadow on the box as well. Looking at the edges of that paper towel roll, I could see that the roll itself is brighter than the background in most areas, except for the shadow. So that helped me notice that the background needed to be a little bit darker. Now I'm using the stump to do some blending, and if you use a brand new stump, you'll notice that the stump is going to act as an eraser at first, so it's going to pull the charcoal off of the drawing, which is fine. You might actually want to keep one side of the stump relatively charcoal free so that when you go over lighter areas, you have a little bit of control over how that charcoal gets smudged around, and then keep the other one quite saturated so when you go over darker areas, you don't accidentally erase them. After blending everything with a stump, I'm using the eraser to bring out some of the highlights in a few of the objects. So the pepper really needed several of the shiny areas, and then the onion had some of those stripes across it, and then the cup also needed a lot of highlights. So the eraser can help with those. So the last thing I'm going to do is just create more detail in each one of these objects. So I'm adding highlights and shadows, finding some of the reflected light. The eraser can be formed into a little point, like a fine point, so you can get some of those really fine details. Or you could shape it like a little wedge and get kind of a line to work with. In any case, the fine detail comes last, so try to save that for last. Start out with a really basic structure of the value system in your drawing, and then work slowly towards more and more detail. The most important things for this drawing are to eliminate all the contours so that your objects don't have any outlines around them. And then the second thing is to create a value structure that actually shows which objects are darker and which ones are lighter.